My name is Margaret Hale. I am 67 years old, a widow, and until that morning, I believed I still understood my place in my own family. I had lived in the same apartment for almost 20 years, long enough to know which floorboard creaked near the stairwell, long enough to recognize my neighbors by the sound of their footsteps, long enough to stop locking the door behind me when I stepped out to check the mail. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Or at least, I thought it was. That morning, I returned from a routine doctor's appointment with a small paper bag of prescriptions tucked under my arm. The hallway on the third floor smelled faintly of old paint and something metallic, the way it always had. The overhead lights flickered once before settling. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing warned me. I slid my key into the lock without looking. It didn't turn. At first, I blamed my hands. Arthritis makes you doubt simple things. I adjusted my grip and tried again. Slower this time. The key scraped against metal, stiff and unfamiliar. I stepped back and stared at the door. The number was right. The scuffed corner near the handle was still there. Even the faint scratch my husband once made while carrying in a bookshelf hadn't disappeared. I knocked. Softly at first, then harder, my knuckles stinging as the sound echoed down the hallway. No one answered. A thin wave of unease crept into my chest as I reached for my phone. I called my son, Daniel, because that's what mothers do when something doesn't make sense. The phone rang twice before the call connected. "Hello?" a woman's voice said. It wasn't my son. It was my daughter-in-law. Her tone was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed, the kind of voice people use when they think they're being reasonable. "You shouldn't be there," she said. "The locks were changed." I laughed once, quietly, because the words didn't land right. "What do you mean, changed?" There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "Daniel agreed to it. You don't live there anymore." The hallway felt suddenly too narrow. I pressed my back against the wall, my phone cold in my hand, my paper bag slipping from my fingers and brushing the floor. I stood there, staring at a door I had opened thousands of times before, trying to understand how a place that had held my life for 2 decades could shut me out without warning, and how my own son could let it happen. I don't remember exactly when the call ended. I only remember lowering the phone and realizing my hand was shaking. For a few seconds, I stood there staring at the door, half expecting it to open on its own, as if this were some kind of misunderstanding that would correct itself if I waited long enough. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of electricity in the lights above me. Someone's television murmured behind a closed door down the hall. Somewhere below, an elevator chimed. Life went on. I knocked again, slower this time, my knuckles sore. Still nothing. That was when it sank in, not all at once, but in small, humiliating pieces. I was standing outside my own home with nowhere to go. I had no coat with me. My purse was still inside the apartment. The only things I had were my phone, my keys, and a paper bag of prescriptions I suddenly couldn't afford to lose. I sat down on the stairwell because my legs no longer felt steady. The steps were cold through my skirt. I pressed my back against the wall and stared at the floor, trying to breathe evenly, the way my late husband used to remind me to do whenever I felt overwhelmed. I told myself Daniel would call back. He had to. This couldn't be his decision. He wouldn't do this without telling me. He wouldn't let me find out like this. But the minutes passed, and my phone stayed silent. A woman from the second floor walked past me carrying groceries. She slowed when she saw me sitting there, hesitated as if she might ask if I was all right, then kept walking. I couldn't blame her. I wouldn't have known what to say either. It was Ruth who finally found me. She came up the stairs carrying a canvas tote bag, stopped short when she saw me, and set it down without a word. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush me. She simply sat beside me and placed a hand over mine. "You're cold," she said quietly. That was when I realized I was... She helped me to my feet and took me to her apartment. It was smaller than mine, cluttered with books and old photographs, but it was warm. She made tea while I sat at her kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the mug as if it were something solid I could hold on to. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out tangled. Changed locks. Daniel agreed. "You don't live there anymore." Each sentence sounded stranger when spoken out loud, as if I were repeating lines from someone else's story. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. "You should stay here tonight," she said. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." That night, I slept on her couch. Or rather, I lay there staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, uneven circles. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door, the number on it, the lock that refused to turn. Sometime after midnight, I checked my phone again. Still nothing from Daniel. In the early morning hours, doubt crept in. Maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe there was paperwork I'd forgotten about. I had signed documents before, at Daniel's request, trusting him to explain what mattered. He'd always been good with details. He'd always told me he was looking out for me. By the time the sun rose, the doubt had curdled into something heavier. After breakfast, Ruth walked back upstairs with me. I wanted to see the apartment in daylight, as if that might change something. The door looked the same as it always had, except for the new lock, sleek, modern, unmistakably intentional. I knocked. This time. The door opened just a few inches. My daughter-in-law stood there, her hand still on the knob, her body angled so I couldn't see inside. She held out a large envelope. "Daniel asked me to give you this," she said. I took it with stiff fingers and opened it right there in the hallway. Inside were copies of legal documents. My name appeared more than once, printed neatly beneath signatures I recognized as my own, a transfer of ownership. I felt the air leave my lungs. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. "You signed it last year," she replied. Her eyes flicked down the hallway, then back to me. "We talked about this." I remembered the conversation then. Daniel had mentioned paperwork, something about simplifying things in case of emergencies. I had trusted him. I hadn't read every page. "I need my purse," I said. "My things." "You can come back later," she said. "We'll arrange a time." Before I could respond, the door closed softly between us. I stood there holding the envelope, the hallway suddenly too bright, too exposed, knowing for the first time that whatever had happened wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. And tomorrow, I would have to face the reality of what that decision had cost me. Ruth insisted we see a lawyer before anything else. I wanted to believe that the papers in my hands didn't mean what they appeared to mean, that there was some mistake buried in fine print, some technicality that could be undone with the right explanation. The law office sat above a small bakery on Main Street. The smell of bread followed us up the narrow staircase. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt, how wrong it seemed that something so life-altering could be handled in a room with beige walls and mismatched chairs. The lawyer, Thomas Reed, was polite in the careful way people are when they already know the answer isn't going to be good. He read through the document slowly, his glasses sliding down his nose as he turned each page. "These were signed legally," he said at last. "Your son is the sole owner of the apartment." I asked him if that meant I had no rights at all. He folded his hands on the desk. "Unless you can prove coercion or fraud, your options are very limited." The words sounded clean and distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. I stared at the edge of his desk, at a faint scratch in the wood, and tried to remember the day I had signed those papers. I remembered Daniel sitting across from me at my kitchen table, telling me it was just to make things easier. I remembered trusting him because he was my son. "Where am I supposed to live?" I asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. "You'll need to make other arrangements." When we left the office, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time, as if something essential had been taken from me but my body hadn't caught up yet. Ruth walked beside me without speaking. Outside, people were lining up at the bakery, laughing, deciding what to order. That afternoon, my daughter-in-law called. She didn't apologize. She didn't raise her voice either. She spoke the way people do when they think they're being generous. "Daniel and I talked," she said. "We're willing to help you get back on your feet." She explained that they would give me some money. Enough, she said, to help with a deposit somewhere else. In return, I would agree not to contest anything and to collect my belongings within a limited time frame. "How much?" I asked. She told me the amount. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to replace a home or a sense of security. It felt like a price placed on my silence. "I need my things," I said. "You can come tomorrow afternoon." She replied, "I'll be there." The next day, Ruth drove me back. I watched the building approach through the windshield, my stomach tightening with every block. The door opened when Erin unlocked it, but she didn't step aside. She stood there as if guarding something. "You can take what you need," she said. "We've already packed some of it." Inside, the apartment felt unfamiliar. Furniture had been moved. The pictures on the walls were gone. Cardboard boxes sat stacked near the door, each one labeled in thick marker. I went first to the bedroom. My dresser drawers were empty. The space where my husband's photograph had always stood was bare. I opened a closet and found only a few coats that weren't mine. "Some items were donated," Erin said from behind me. "Things you probably didn't need anymore." The words stung more than I expected. I moved slowly through the rooms, opening boxes, closing them again when I saw what was missing. Letters, small keepsakes, things that didn't look important to anyone else. In the living room, I saw my grandson sitting on the couch. He held a video game controller but wasn't playing. When he looked up and saw me, his face fell. I knelt in front of him without thinking. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. He leaned forward and whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandma." Before I could ask him what he meant, Erin called his name sharply from the kitchen. He flinched and looked away. I stood up, my chest tight, and realized how little space I truly had there. Every movement felt observed. Every second felt borrowed. By the time we left, I had only a few boxes and a suitcase. As Ruth loaded them into the car, I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows. Somewhere behind them was the life I had built, reduced to what could be carried away in one trip. That night, back in Ruth's apartment, I opened the suitcase and stared at its contents: clothing, toiletries, a handful of photographs I had managed to rescue. I lay awake listening to the city settle around me, understanding something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't just about property or paperwork. I had been erased from my own life. And if I wanted to survive what came next, I would have to learn how to exist without the safety I had spent years believing would never be taken from me. The first thing I learned after losing my home was how loud silence could be. Ruth never complained about having me there, but I could feel myself taking up space that wasn't meant for me. I folded my blankets every morning. I washed my cup as soon as I finished my tea. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to live with. It didn't change the fact that I was sleeping on someone else's couch. I spent my days looking for a place of my own. The numbers never worked out the way I hoped they would. Rent had risen while my savings had not. Every listing came with requirements I couldn't meet or prices that made my chest tighten. When I called about part-time work, the conversations always ended politely, the same way. They thanked me for my interest and told me they'd be in touch. They never were. Eventually, I accepted a job doing overnight companion care for an elderly woman a few miles away. The work wasn't physically demanding, mostly sitting beside her bed, reminding her to take her medication, listening when she woke confused in the dark. The pay was modest, but it was something I could rely on my days off. I started going to a free yoga class at the community center. I didn't tell anyone why I was there. I told myself it was for my joints, for my back. The truth was, I needed somewhere to be that wasn't Ruth's living room. The people in the class didn't ask questions either. They smiled. They made room for me on the mat, for an hour at a time. I focused on breathing instead of remembering. Weeks passed. Daniel didn't call. Sometimes my phone would light up with his name, only for the call to end before I could answer. Once, I managed to catch it. "Mom," he said quickly. His voice sounded tight, unfamiliar. "I can't talk long. I just want to understand," I said. There was a pause on the line, filled with faint background noise. Then he said, "Please don't say anything over the phone. I'll explain soon." Before I could ask what he meant, the call ended. That night, I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the blank television screen, replaying his words. "Don't say anything. Explain soon." None of it made sense, and yet something in his tone unsettled me more than anger would have. Not long after that, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a drawing from Noah. It showed a building with a large door and a heavy lock drawn in thick black lines. Outside the door stood a small figure with gray hair. Inside, another figure stood behind the lock, their face scribbled over. In the corner of the page, Noah had written, "I miss you." I sat there holding the paper, my throat tight, wondering how much my grandson understood and how much he was being asked to keep quiet about. By then, I had found a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just one room with a narrow kitchen and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, but it was mine. I signed the lease with hands that shook only a little. The first night I slept there, the walls felt too close. Every sound startled me. But when I woke in the morning, I realized something important. No one could lock me out of this place. I began to settle into a routine. Work at night, yoga during the day, coffee with a woman from the class who had also lost her husband. Small things that stitched my days together again. Still, the questions followed me. Why had Daniel really done this? Why had Aaron been so cold, so precise, as if every word had been rehearsed? Why did Noah look at me like he was carrying something heavy? The anger I'd felt at first softened into something more complicated. Hurt, confusion, a dull ache that didn't go away. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Thomas Reed," the voice said. "Your son contacted my office. He's asking to meet. He says it's urgent." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed. "Did he say why?" I asked. There was a pause. "He said he needs to tell you the truth." After the call ended, I stared at the wall across from me, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the fragile stability I had built. Another part, the part that had raised a child and trusted him with her life, knew I couldn't. Whatever had been hidden from me was finally coming into the light, and I wasn't sure whether it would break what I had rebuilt or explain everything I had lost. Daniel was already there when I arrived at the law office. He stood near the window, his shoulders slumped, his hands buried deep in his pockets like he didn't know what to do with them. I hadn't seen him this close in months, and the first thing that struck me was how thin he looked, older somehow, as if the weight he'd been carrying had finally pressed through his skin. He turned when he heard me, his eyes filling almost immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't know how else to do it. We sat across from each other, Thomas Reed positioned slightly to the side, quiet but present. Daniel spoke slowly, choosing his words the way someone does when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. He told me about a debt that wasn't his, a family member of Aaron's who had dragged them into something dangerous. There had been threats, men showing up at work, a car following Aaron home more than once. They'd gone to the police, but the advice had been cautious. Protect the child, reduce leverage, make it clear who had assets and who did not. "They knew about the apartment," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "About you. They asked questions." He told me the decision to change the locks wasn't about cruelty. It was about distance, about making sure anyone watching would believe I had been cut off completely, that there was nothing to take from me anymore. "I hated it," he said. "Every day." Thomas slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were documents, a police report, a record of the apartment sale, bank statements showing the remaining funds transferred into a trust bearing my name. "We didn't touch it," Daniel said quickly. "It's yours. Every dollar." I stared at the papers, my vision blurring. The explanation fit together too neatly, like a puzzle finally finished, and yet the pain it explained didn't disappear. "You could have told me," I said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You wouldn't have played along. You would have tried to help, and that would have put you in danger." I sat back, exhaustion washing over me. He hadn't meant to destroy me, but intent didn't erase impact. "I lost my home," I said. "I lost my sense of safety." I stood in a hallway and felt disposable. "I know," he whispered. I didn't reach for him then. I needed him to understand that love didn't excuse everything. It took time after that. Weeks of careful conversations, short visits with Noah, who clung to me like he was afraid I'd disappear again. One quiet afternoon, Erin finally broke down in front of me, her hands shaking as she admitted how terrified she'd been, how tightly she'd held herself together until there was nothing left. I listened. I didn't forgive her right away. With the money from the trust, I bought a small place of my own. Nothing like the apartment I'd lost. It was quieter, smaller. But it opened when I turned the key. I kept my job. I kept my yoga class. I kept my new friends. Daniel and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, with boundaries that hadn't existed before. I learned something I wish I'd understood earlier. Family can love you deeply and still hurt you in ways that take years to heal. Trust is not a gift you give once and forget about. It is something you protect, even from the people closest to you. I still carry my keys carefully now. I feel their weight in my hand before I leave the house, before I come back. They remind me that my life is mine to guard. And this time, I make sure the door opens because I choose to open it. I am no longer waiting for permission to belong anywhere, not in a house, not in a family, not even in my own memories. What happened changed me, but it did not erase me. I learned how to stand without leaning on promises that could be taken back. The door that closed taught me something that open ones never had. It taught me to choose myself, even when doing so felt lonely and frightening. And in that choice, I found a quiet strength that no one else could take from me again. I lock my door at night now, not out of fear, but out of respect for the life I rebuilt, and I sleep knowing I earned it. Fully. Finally.